I am absolutely delighted to be here. I want to become an honorary citizen of the Midwest. And although I am a teacher at Yale, as Lee pointed out, I really want to emphasize that I am not a scholar like Suzanne and Bradley. I'm an architect, and I teach architecture from that point of view. And I've been teaching for a very long time, long enough that I actually used slides when I lectured, way back when, and I still have my slide library. It's doesn't get much use, but it's very well organized. And I have literally thousands of slides. This box is one of more than a dozen. And I made my own slides, and I organized it all by myself, the way we used to do it, you know, for those of you in the audience old enough to remember, with a copy stand and a close-up lens and a long roll of Mylar tape to do the kind of cropping that the camera couldn't do. And I first looked at and made slides of Eero Saarinen's work when I was in college at RISD. He was, and as Lee said, he remains my favorite architect. I did a presentation on his work, telling my classmates and my professor about the brilliant diversity of what he had done, but that was actually not my first encounter, my first love affair with Eero Saarinen. That was actually the CBS building. This was back in the 60s when I was a girl. I grew up in New York City, and in the outer boroughs, I must admit, and I fell in love with this building. I fell in love with this building before I even thought about becoming an architect. It was dark and hulking and looming, and it had this great crenellated profile against the sky, although, of course, at that age, I didn't know any of those words at all. It was a tough building. It didn't have any of those delicate mullions. You know, it was like, I'm tough and I'm here, and, you know, the New York of that period needed or perhaps evoked buildings like that. You might ask, what was I doing in anywhere near the CBS building on the very commercial part of 6th Avenue? And that's because when I was a young girl, my cool, I didn't know it then, but I certainly appreciate it now, parents had a very favorite restaurant called La Fonda del Sol, which was right around the corner from the CBS building. And I loved this restaurant, too. I didn't know at the time that its playful, colorful, sophisticated interiors were done by Alexander Gerard, but that's one of those lovely anecdotes that makes this story hang together all the better. My father actually collected matchbooks. He worked in the hospitality industry for a while from all of his favorite restaurants. So I had these at home when I was a kid. And from my father, I also got a love for books. And to get away from the restaurant and get us a little more current, I do have more than a few books on Saarinen. And in my office, we actually use books. And this was the stack that was on my desk prior, actually, to preparing for this talk, just because I was investigating some other ideas so they don't just sit on the shelf. Anyway, enough of an introduction on that part. When architects talk about Saarinen, one of the most common comments or observations or even criticisms, particularly if they're not fans of his work, is that his work has no recognizable or signature style. This, of course, is one of the characteristics I most admire, but there are those who expect the identity of an architect to be immediately legible, as it is, say, in the work of a Frank Gehry or a Richard Meyer. Where when you look at Saarinen's work, it's virtually a Where's Waldo of finding the similarities and an absolute litany of differences. So in this collection of buildings, you know, the famous IBM Center is all about color and reflectivity. The TWA terminal is a soaring metaphoric structure. Morrison Stiles College at Yale are historic solidity cloaked in modernism. Dulles is, of course, the invention of an entire system that unfortunately didn't stick in terms of air transportation. The MIT Chapel is a windowless form. The War Memorial is cantilevered brutalism. The bank I would call delicate transparency, and as was pointed out earlier, a great metaphor for a bank. Who knew we'd need that metaphor? The church is a kind of celebratory reach to the heavens, and of course my CBS building is a dark, impenetrable statement of power. The same can be said about the interiors. I have one of the books in that stack is an old book from the 70s with an introduction by a guy named Rupert Spade, who I otherwise know nothing about. And he said about Saarinen's work that it wasn't about style, but, quote, he tried to overtake the fast-moving train of technology and impose upon it a system of checks and balances similar in effect to the discipline of classical and Renaissance architecture. Spade notes Saarinen did not have time to complete his effort. Spade says, the search for continuity or a consistent theory of design in Saarinen's work is futile. The consistency lay in his head. And who knows, if Saarinen had lived a long life and done a lot more work, we might have understood some holistic message about architecture he was trying to send us. If there had been a large body of work, we might actually see it differently. Sadly, he died very young. Another book. Architects like to categorize. They like to think about their work in terms of its size, among many other things, perhaps program, style, location, but size. And this way of thinking was, of course, very wittily represented in this Bruce Mau designed cover of the book that he and Rem Koolhaas did a number of years ago. It was certainly a must-have cult item in architecture school, entitled Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, or SMLXL for its friends. So here's something to think about relative to Eero Saarinen. He did small things, and he did large things. And in fact, I had to enlarge the profile of the chair 10 times so that you could see it in scale with this large thing like the Jefferson Memorial Arch. And in fact, he did small things and he did extra large things. And in this scale comparison, I had to enlarge the table, the iconic table, 50 times so that you could see it relative to the General Motors Technical Center of 1948 to 1956. And this definitely meets Rem's criteria for extra large at 900 acres with buildings conceived at the scale of the automobile and the nature of automobile movement. This campus for GM cost $100 million in 1956, and that was when that was real money, right? But what Saarinen didn't do was very many medium-sized things like houses. So this shows, this graphic analysis, how many small projects, how many medium projects, how many large projects, and how many extra large projects. You'll have to trust me, we categorize them relatively intelligently. And if you look at this timeline, which I apologize you can't read, but maybe it's better just as a graphic image, you can really see how many medium or residential projects he did. The residential projects sit below the line, the single-family houses, and the non-residential projects sit above the line. There's also another interesting thing going on in this diagram, which I hope you'll enjoy and appreciate. The gray dots represent work Saarinen did with his father. The blue dots represent work Saarinen did on his own. So the ones way over on the young side of his career is like designing a bedroom for his sister. The red dots are projects he did with Charles Eames. The few green dots that you'll find were other collaborative efforts, and everything that isn't a solid but rather an outline dot is an unbuilt project. So although you can see, particularly towards the end of his life, an enormous number of built work in a very small time frame, you also see an enormous amount of unbuilt work, particularly below the line in the medium. For the purposes of this talk, the medium equals residential architecture. It equals the domestic. Unfortunately, the letter M doesn't work with the spelling of domestic, not with the spelling of residential, not with the spelling of habitation, nor with any single word I could find in Finnish that meant remotely any of those things, so I gave up, and it just M equals living. I zoomed in on that timeline to give you a closer look at the significant residential projects and look at their timeline with selected larger projects. You can see that he was working on some very large things at the time that he was working on the houses that I'm going to talk about in particular today, including particularly the General Motors Technical Center and the Willow Run Town Center, big buildings. And below the houses, which you see the duration of the process, you see a number of unbuilt, few but very special and really kind of sweet, fine things, studies of parts of houses, the combined living dining room, or the PAC, which is actually a prefab kind of project, which we're going to take a closer look at. Here is just a list for your convenience, which in bold shows those projects which were actually built. A few slides ago, I showed you those 9 Saarinen famous exteriors, and they were as diverse in program and image and style and my description as imaginable. And then another 9 interiors, similarly stylistically varied. Those images made me ask myself whether one might make the same observation about the houses he designed, or in fact, embedded in the houses were unifying principles, some sort of guiding principles where we might see into how Saarinen felt about the design of a house, and that his strategies for doing the medium, doing the domestic, doing the residential, were actually more similar, where his strategies for doing houses, for non-houses, was about those things being more different. So these 4, the PAC, the pre-assembled components of 1943, the Miller House, the Case Study House, and the GM House of Tomorrow, we're going to look at briefly here. I tried to find patterns, and then I thought I'd steal something from Alexander Gerard and turn them into, I don't know, textiles when I leave here today. No. The houses are of very, very different sizes. As you can see, the PAC, the pre-assembled components, could neatly fit in the living room of the Miller House. But despite that enormous range in scale, there is, a remarkable consistency in the organization. The bedrooms in each house make a solid block, as do other private areas. So to be very dumb about it, privacy is understood as solidity. Similarly, kitchen and service areas are also, even though there's obviously flow to where one might be eating, are understood as a whole or as a massive rectangle. And Suzanne talked about this a little bit in her talk as well. Interestingly, the dining area, and I'm sorry I didn't live in an era to know Saarinen, because I'd love to know if he liked food, but there's a lot of emphasis on food. The dining areas are always articulated, even when they're small. In the vocabulary of a New York real estate broker, you never find an FDR, or a formal dining room, in a Saarinen house, as in a closed room with a sort of axial relationship to the living room. These dining rooms aren't enclosed by walls, but the area is always identifiable and in some instances can be screened off. And with the exception of the smallest house, which didn't have one at all, the garage is part of the house. You can see it's collected within the rectangle. It's not detached, it's not in a wing, it's within and part of a single recognizable volume of the house, which is probably a very different attitude toward the automobile than was held before this period, and certainly than is held today. Again, with the exception of the smallest house, there is actually a pit. In one of his drawings, it's labeled the lounge pit, which I think might be a good name for a bar. To me, it helps define the core of the house. The core isn't solid like a fireplace was in a traditional house, although we will see that Saarinen did his best to make less of the mass of the fireplace as well. But it's actually a sunken void meant to be inhabited. So inhabitation and togetherness is actually the core of the house. And from this void and around this habitable core, the living area expands basically out until it hits a solid. So that the living room, a word that typically calls to mind an identifiable volume and shape in the lexicon of the American house, like a rectangle, is defined by its center and its irregular edges of immovable solids rather than by the walls and the elements that one typically associates with the perimeter of a living room. All of this is then captured by a roof. And even the smallest house, and you can see that there, has a moment where the roof extends beyond the volumes of the walls beneath it and the mass below it to stake a claim on the land and blur that inside-outside distinction. I think one of the things we can learn from Saarinen's houses is that it doesn't take much to do it. You don't have to go shooting way out there. Just this little inflection of the wall and the roof extending beyond it is a gesture that the outside is actually an extension and habitable part of the inside. So when overlaid all these different diagrams, at a simple look, you realize that the houses create similar patterns no matter what their size. So much for this misnomer, that misunderstanding, I would say, that all of Saarinen's work is wildly different. And when reduced to a solid and void diagram, they reveal that the primary living area is never a rectangle, even in the simplest and smallest house. It's always a space with the possibility of long oblique views and extensions beyond its literal definition, both interior and exterior. The Miller House sits on a large, expansive, spectacular piece of property, as you've already seen, of which the house is only a very small part. And actually, I put the diagram of the house onto this plan so you can actually find it, as it otherwise gets lost. Well, now you know where it is, of course. As it otherwise gets lost in the larger grid and organization of the landscape. And I'm sure that's something Laurie's going to talk about later. I love this plan from the Yale archives. I love how you can feel the age and actual fact that somebody physically handled this drawing, and I think a connection to a textile materiality. It's maybe evidenced in this drawing, but is really something very true about all of the houses that Saarinen made. As you have heard, the house sits on a landscaped plinth, a raised area, a raised plateau above the floodplain under an all-encompassing roof. And it's interesting from this distance how the roof is so much stronger than any of those exquisite columns, which you really only discover as you get a lot closer. And the house plays a kind of game, a dance, I would say, with the proximity of the trees and those columns in relationship to the trunks and the branches. And the carving back, or the push and pull of the exterior vertical surface, pushed in here, pulled out there, forward and back, relative to the mass of the roof, makes rooms that are defined by the outdoors, or in many instances, part of the outdoors. And of course, those slender columns, which with their expanding cross capitals, one of the things this photograph shows so beautifully, and you saw it in some of Suzanne's details, is that the columns themselves slip into light, not into mass. The beauty of this house, to me, and I'm a kind of liney-uppy person, is how delightfully rigorous it is, but at the same time, slightly slippery. The grid has some incredible moments, and they're not all liney-uppy, quite the contrary. And I kept studying this in plan and confirmed it on a visit to the house that the skylight that travels, I'm pointing at the screen, of course, which you can't see, the skylight that travels across the lounge pit is not, anybody who is sort of plan compulsive would have lined up the edge of the pit with the edge of the skylight. But no, this is about inhabitation. So where the light is coming in is on the faces of the occupants of the pit. So it's this subtle slip-slidey relative to the grid that makes this house so livable. The volumes obey the column lines, basically, until they don't, so that the kitchen volume slips past to make a more intimate, the kitchen volume slips past this column line to make a more intimate dining area. And there are a number of moments in this plan. I would say this space has now been pointed out to you several times. Seemingly, at first glance, ill-defined leftover space shaped by solids, pinwheeling space is in fact perfectly organized. So it is a combination of, an entrance initially stopped by a beautiful wall, further stopped as you progress by a more distant wall with long views this way to the outside, this way to the outside, and those views captured at different levels. I'm sure Bradley will talk about this, that even the seating, whether you're in the pit, you have one relationship to the landscape, or at the dining table, you have another. And I'm sure you all know the famous story about the bases of the chairs, such that that lower view out would not be sort of ruined by too many chair legs. Each chair only has one leg. So the space is, in fact, the space that matters, not the solids. And just like in Rome, okay, I realize this is a stretch, but I liked the brown on brown following each other. The Noli map is another architect's favorite, where what is public is not necessarily determined by what's indoors or what's outdoors, but a matter of those shared spaces sometimes being defined by the private volumes, and public spaces sometimes being those things which are inside, as all the architects in the room knows. And this is true whether the shared space or the public space is fully figural or somewhat mushy and slippy or not. It can be both. Oops, I'm sorry, that was wrong. Hope it didn't blind anybody. Eero and his father shared this idea of an interest in context. But I think it's important to recognize what context means in these two quotes. I won't read them to you because I assume you all can read. Context is not looking like the building next to you, or the building down the block, or the flavor du jour of the preservation mentality of the moment. Context, as is aptly said here by Eliel and reiterated with a slightly different spin by Eero, context is in thinking of whatever it is you are designing in terms of the next largest thing. So I thought it would be interesting to take a look at some of Saarinen's M-sized projects, the houses, and see if there were present in them some design devices that were about the next largest thing. Despite its small size, it is laid out as a courtyard with transparency at its center. This is the pre-assembled component house. It's 24 by 32. It's very small. How is it conceived of in terms of the next largest thing? Well, that courtyard and transparency at its center, as it sits on the street, one can see through it. It kind of expands from front to back, which can be controlled at times, but also let sail, so that the expansiveness of this otherwise tiny, tiny thing can be shared with the street and from the back. I think he really thought about this in terms of how it might sit in a small, dense suburban neighborhood of the types that were developing at the time. And thinking about the GM house of tomorrow in the next largest context, or perhaps the next smallest, I want you to notice this moment here in the plan, which is a storage wall of elegance that might compete with what's in the Miller House living room, but created for tools. So those tools in the context of the garage in the context of the house. I mean, the house was designed for GM, of course. And it also has a similar front-to-back transparency as the pack house did, but this time it's layered so that you get the car in its court, transparency, an outdoor court in the middle, and then the living room as an indoor court which faces the backyard at the back, all three defined by solids on either sides, but not solids between them, so that you see through as a layer. And the court and the living room become the next larger context, to go back to Saarinen's quote, for the car. I mean, it's funny to think about this at this time in America, that identifiable car grill actually becomes an element in the interior facade of the courtyard, and by extension, the living room, because you can see back and see the big words splashed across the front of your car and its dramatic grill. And on the street, the signature tail lights are framed, you know, with a large unifying roof that really is a framing element for the rear end of the car, the identity of you and your house. So check out this fabulous sketch of a dock and a sailboat below this drawing of the Bell House, perhaps a metaphor for the idea of a house as a dock in the larger landscape. I think it is interesting that the view of this house is out the end, like the way you are compelled to walk to the end of the dock. You understand the house in the larger context of its topography. The house becomes a bar slipping off the hill with a view out its end. As was mentioned earlier, Case Study House 8, in which Saarinen collaborated with Eames. This was not the one that was built, of course, which was done, I would guess, with some ideas from this one, but very much by Eames without Saarinen. This is not the one that got built, but I think it's really interesting to contrast this one with the last one and to understand that in this one, the next larger context is looking out the side. So it's not a bridge, it's not a dock, it's a picture frame for the landscape beyond. But also lifted up, not as pronounced, what you're getting is a definition of panorama from a privileged view. And case study number 9, the immediate context is at a much smaller scale. It's that lowered courtyard right outside the living room, which shows so nicely in the black and white photograph, and captured in part by that long, thick, floating roof, as in the Miller House. The roof extends not just to define the area of the exterior living room, meaning that the edge of paving and the edge of roof line up with each other in plan. They don't at all. The roof extends just enough to imply expansion and movement outward. Now, as you know, because you've seen the Miller Cottage, this site is very, very different. It's beyond rural, it's remote, it's not suburban, it's not on a street, there's no chance of a repetitive location or a relationship with a neighbor or the house itself being repeated. It is unique and on a stunning site. And the next larger context, to go back to that idea, is perhaps the cliff that it sits on to one side. The elevation on that cliff, the building's elevation, I should say, confronts that vertical edge. It separates the trees from the ground. It strikes a kind of very definitive horizontal line in a place where one is experiencing the vertical. The stone base, I think, very intentionally blends in with the ground so that Saarinen can strike this very hard horizontal line made more visible by color to make his mark in this landscape. When freed from the constraints of a small rectangular lot and the grid of any kind, when working in huge open grandeur of Canada, Saarinen allows himself to sprawl too, so that the next larger context is everything around, and you are given the opportunity in this outdoor space to experience that total expanse. So I put this quote up again, not because I was short on slides, I have lots of slides, but to try to go in the other direction, actually. Since so much about residential life is about small things, to look at the small, and perhaps the extra small, even if that isn't on the cover of Rem's book, in the context of the medium that he was creating. Because life is about those small things, and what the architect is doing is making the space around them. In this fabulous study for a very small multi-purpose room that encompassed many aspects of living, we find extraordinary details called out in the drawing. Like words, if you track around the outside of this plan, you'll see, carefully noted, 350 books. A small thing that needs context, right? You see how many card tables will fit, and you see exactly where the loudspeaker, the records, the Victrola, the radio. In fact, you see a sketch of a ceramic piece in a sort of hearth-like position. You see how the chairs work. You see how the bar works. I love the moment where it says bar on wheels under table, because I have a madman moment in my mind the minute I read that. So you call out all these extraordinary elements and you put them in a context of your own creation, a simple rectangular room that in fact can be very small and simple because it's the things that are in its context. A more traditional house done by Saarinen with his father, obviously an early project, and this idea of the next larger context, I would argue, is around these two significant areas of the house. The curving wall, which, somewhat reminiscent of the Tugendhat house, of course, throws its protective arm around the dining table, a kind of sheltering corner without a right angle, and a similar small gesture to terminate the porch, and I think, again, to make you feel protected and sheltered, which is what home is supposed to be. And in case study house number 9, creating a context perhaps for a fireplace and for a coffee table, which is to say, wrapping a couch around a table and a fireplace, making an intimate space. And this one, and you saw, of course, the one in the Miller house, the idea that a fireplace isn't even really a solid anymore. It's almost a quasi-transparent element that is in the room with you, not making the edge of the room. But here, the low seating and the low floor that slips directly to the outside, the continuity of the floor surface, as I said, you are in a large space but sheltered at the same time. He's making a context for these pieces of everyday life, like coffee tables and pillows and couches, within the slightly larger context of the architecture. The Miller house, Miller cottage, also has a conversation pit, and it's folded into the larger landscape of these gently folding moves, which are so different from the gridded houses, are really about the expanse and angularity of this landscape, but you see it there outlined in red. And what you have in the picture on the left, and you can see those little risers, that the couch is pushed up against that change in level, again, that intimacy in the context of a larger, kind of tougher, and perhaps in some ways right outside the window, more brutal, albeit beautiful, environment, as though the contrast heightens both the intimacy as well as the presence of the tough, hard stuff like the stone. So we come, of course, inevitably to that most iconic of conversation pits, the one at the Miller house. And Suzanne has told you all the wonderful stories which Will had told me as well. But to put it in the terms of this next larger context, it's a place for textiles, for color and pattern in this otherwise field of hard whiteness, and changing textiles as that, which I'm sure is something Bradley's going to talk about. The long vistas in this house were divided by curtains, and you can see that the two red lines, each with a slightly different textile, all made to work with the warmth of the travertine floor. And I won't go into any more detail about this either, as I know Brad will. But the softness of the curtains made the room great contrasting conversations within themselves between size and texture of sewn and the hand and nature and color of the fabric. So you see the furniture in the soft context of the textile as well as against the scale and massive sort of velvety beauty of the stone walls. So my guy, my favorite architect, Eero Saarinen, really didn't do too many medium projects, only small projects and extra large projects. And to my mind, the houses may have been medium in size, but they get their magic by simultaneously shrinking the domestic down to its details, down to the deeply personal, and expanding that very same domestic beyond the roof and even beyond the property lines. This is understood perhaps most clearly in his best house, the Miller House. In all its absolute exquisiteness, these two strategies are working simultaneously. The column extends to the sky. It's not only a virtuosic display of craftsmanship and construction and a gravity-defying gesture, as if to say the next largest context for this house is the sky itself. The color and texture of the scale of the work inside is done by hand, where the hand is actually visible and it finds its balance, as I said, against the stone, which are scaled at the extra large. Rooms extend, but they're clearly defined at the same time, making places for their contents and for their inhabitants. Flexibility and individuality. A grid here, a metal grid on a wall in the master bedroom, a grid almost at the scale of a bold textile, but made in metal, allows for a deeply personal collection of objects to change over time. The tiniest thing in its next largest context. In fact, you can see Mrs. Miller collected crosses, and they're within a frame, and some of them are less than an inch probably. Significant connections to the outdoors expand small, unimportant rooms and connect them to the sort of profundity of that large property and its flat Midwestern characteristics. My favorite architect designed my favorite kitchen in America. And in this case, the next largest context might well have been food and family. I am very lucky. I've actually been to the Miller House 3 times. The first time I was there was during a blizzard. I mentioned this to some of you over lunch. It was a huge storm. It was when I was working on my first project in Columbus. I didn't know Will Miller very well. In fact, he had sort of given me a horrible critique of a building I had designed for Columbus. He came by the hotel and he said, "I have a treat for you. My mother's away, why don't we go see her house?" And we went and saw it in a blizzard, which you see in the upper left slide. The house both cluttered yet serene in the snow. Eero Saarinen said, and this is a quote, a famous quote, "The purpose of architecture is to shelter and enhance man's life on earth and to fulfill his belief in the nobility of his existence." And that's what all of our houses should do. Thank you.